And I'm delighted to be joined for this session by Dr. Jonathan Fulton, who's Assistant Political Professor at Zayed University. And this is a topic that Dr. Fulton's going to go into today that's very close to my heart around geopolitics in the Gulf and the evolving geopolitical situation in the Gulf and the wider world and its significance. And I think on that note, Jonathan, if I just pass over to you and let's get started.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Really pleasure being here today with you, and nice to meet you finally, albeit virtually. So thanks to the Energy Forum for inviting me. I was just thinking last night as I was preparing for this, the last time I did this was 2 years ago. And as I was getting ready to go into NYUAD from here in Khalifa City, I looked on Twitter and saw that the Ukrainian international flight 752 had just been shot down, leaving Tehran. And by the time I arrived to NYUAD for the Energy Forum, everybody was really aghast, wondering what does this mean for the region, for the world, for us personally. There was really kind of a panic hanging over us, but little did we know there were even bigger concerns in the short term. So, you know, that was really the last local event I think I did before all of this started. I kind of look back to the Energy Forum as the good old days. You know, since that time, there's been obviously a lot of tremendous change at the regional level. You know, there's been political change, leadership changes in Oman and Kuwait. There's been the Abraham Accords. There's been the Al-Ola Summit in Saudi. You know, there's been engagement between a lot of Gulf countries and other regional powers that there hadn't been for quite a while. I'm thinking the UAE's outreach to Turkey and Iran in recent months. There's been a lot of change at the regional level, and there are a lot of folks better qualified than me to discuss that. And I'm sure you don't have to look far to find them, but my focus is more at the, you know, Andrew mentioned I'm a political scientist. I'll try to limit the jargon, but when we study international relations, we kind of look at things at the regional level, or what we call the systemic level, you know, the stuff that's happening beyond, you know, the countries, just looking at how the international order works. And there's been a lot of change at that international order. Obviously, over the past 5, 10, 20 years, and that is what's shaping, I think, a lot of events here in the region. So I'm going to kind of give that big picture look at what are the forces internationally that are shaping regional order, and how do they impact the Gulf. The first big one, obviously, is this idea we're living with a global order transition. And, you know, that's an IR term basically to say that we've lived in a pretty structured international order since the end of the Cold War. You know, from 1990 to about 2001, you know, we had that post-Cold War period where we all lived under US leadership and everything seemed to make sense. There wasn't much in the way of great power competition. You know, US preponderance was a fact. The US is by far the most powerful country in the world, and nobody else was even close. And US leadership tended to align with what a lot of other powerful countries preferred. So it didn't really result in a lot of, you know, competition or challenges. We saw countries like Russia and China that were content to kind of free ride or bandwagon with the US because they were somewhat weak or vulnerable, and they needed time to develop and face their domestic problems. And the fact that the US was supporting them in a lot of this made for an easier go of it. That's not to say it was, you know, the good old days by any stretch. I mean, all we have to do is remember the Balkans or Rwanda or any number, you know, of really awful things that were happening. But that's just to say at the great power level, you know, there wasn't a lot of struggle or strife. And you'll notice I used 2001 as the cutoff point because, you know, we still continued to have this US great, you know, US leadership. But of course, that was a big transition or big inflection point. You know, we saw this second stage of the post-Cold War order when U.S. leadership started to get challenged. You know, and that of course is most obvious when we see the invasion of Iraq in 2003, when you saw a lot of U.S. allies like France and like Germany especially that were very stridently opposed to it. Other partners or allies like Canada, which don't feature as a great power, but also refused to bandwagon along with it for strategic and political reasons. And you also saw countries like Russia and China start to look differently at the US and think, okay, look, if the leader of the order is willing to change the rules of the game, if sovereignty of states is no longer sacrosanct, if they're willing to change a country's regime type because it doesn't fit with their preferences, then this is a problem for them as well, because obviously Russia and China were not democratic and they saw this as a potential threat. This really came to a head, I'd say, again, around 2008. We had this global, financial crisis, and a lot of this originated from US practices in the financial sector, and a lot of countries were very badly affected by it. And it further, I think, raised questions about the utility of allowing the US to set the rules. So you start to see, a lot of big transitions taking place, long before we got to the point where we are now. This has been a steady drip, but where we are now, I think, is a result of the beginnings of that period. You look at the countries that are the most obvious candidates for the ones I mentioned already, Russia and China. In Russia, and Andrew can speak to this much better than me, but you can look at Russia's response in 2008 in the South Caucasus. You look at Russia's reaction to NATO in Libya, Russia's engagement in Syria, and of course, the Ukraine in 2014. You look at how it started to disrupt domestic situations in the UK, the US, and the EU and their domestic political elections and media landscapes. And clearly Russia had decided, by 2008, if not earlier, that it was willing to pursue a more activist role, instead of acting mostly as a follower, that it was going to try to set the agenda for itself. I think 2008 is an important year looking at China as well. And my research is focused on China-Middle East relations. China, especially in 2008, that was a big year because that was the year they hosted the Olympics. Of course, that was a massive success. Chinese people were rightfully quite proud of the image they were able to portray of China to the rest of the world, much like Korea did in 1988, when people had one vision of the place as a developing country, and then they saw the spectacle and the amazing developmental changes and thought, wow, this country has really come a lot further than we thought. But also the fact that China emerged from the great financial crisis largely unscathed, I think changed a lot of the thinking in Beijing, where their leaders went from looking at themselves as kind of the students of American financial and economic school, to thinking that maybe they had their own lessons to teach the rest of the world. So, we tend to look at China as changing under the leadership of Xi Jinping, which started in 2012. But I think you can go back to 2008 and see that, again, the foundation was already in place. We also tend to forget the fact that under former President Hu Jintao, who left in 2012, well, it was in 2010 when Obama announced the pivot to Asia. The U.S. was going to remove resources from the Middle East and dedicate them to the Asian theater. And of course, for China, that was a big warning flag. This is a containment strategy in the eyes of Beijing. And I don't think it's a coincidence that around that time, you start to see this island building in the South China Sea and the rise of what a lot of analysts started calling the new assertiveness, where China was starting to act like a much more assertive, rather than a second-tier power, but a Asian power, certainly, and an emerging global power. So, this stuff had been developing for quite a while. And in China's case, we saw, again, with Xi Jinping taking power in 2012. In 2013, he announced the Belton Road Initiative, which is China's largest geopolitical initiative ever. It certainly increased China's reach, its investment, its economic model, its political norms across Eurasia and the Indian Ocean region, and increasingly the rest of the world. So China's being, much more comfortable with this idea of challenging U.S. leadership in a lot of ways. Less obvious choices would be the EU. Like I said, France and Germany were opposed to the invasion of Iraq. They start to plot a more assertive or independent foreign policy, and that's definitely increased in recent years, especially under the Trump administration, which I haven't really gotten to yet. But with things like the American pullout of the JCPOA, to bring it back to the Gulf, this is something that affected the EU economically. France and Germany had the potential to do quite a significant amount of trade and manufacturing. in Iran under the JCPOA, and for the US to unilaterally pull out resulted in a lot of European countries thinking that maybe they should start to chart an even more independent regional foreign policy. And even Asian powers, countries like Japan and Korea, which had long relied on US security alliances or commitments, their relationship is frayed in recent years. They've started to act a little more independently in Asia as well. So there is definitely a more fluid order taking place. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like yet. It's not a bipolar Cold War system, despite what we keep hearing about a US-China Cold War. I think it's a lot more dynamic than that because we have so many different actors. The idea that the EU and the US are aligned doesn't work anymore. The idea that we talk about a West, I think, is kind of a tired notion, because even within Europe and the UK, you obviously see a lot of differences between the US, depending on their political administrations. You see some ruptures between them and traditional allies. And you start to see a lot of countries that would normally fit under this Western umbrella going in different directions. So it's a very fluid dynamic. And I think what we see mostly is a set of regional powers. Think India, think of East Asia as being, this tripolar environment with the US and China and Japan competing or cooperating, depending on, how balance of power dynamics work. It's really becoming a different situation. And as a result of this, we see the second big trend, which is this emergence of what the US has called either great power competition or strategic competition. And this is more than a catchphrase. From 2001, until about 2017, US foreign and defense policy was largely shaped by this doctrine of counterterrorism in response to 2001. And of course, that shaped a lot of what the US did around the world, and what a lot of US allies and partners did as well. By 2017, it wasn't just a matter of Donald Trump as president wanting to go in a different direction. I think obviously there was a lot of appetite in the US for a different type of international role. People were tired of the forever wars. People were tired of US leadership at what, no matter what the cost. And instead of going with counterterrorism and trying to police the world, the US National Security Agency, the Department of Defense, the White House all started using this great power competition framework to describe how they saw the next level or next stage of US foreign policy. And that targeted specifically Russia and China. But the way it targeted made a lot of allies and partners very uncomfortable, because it put them kind of in the firing line of this competition. Under the Biden administration, they've stopped using the phrase great power competition. They now say strategic competition, but it's basically the same idea. They've switched to this 2+3 framework, and this 2 represents the 2 primary threats, which are Russia and China. The 3 represent the secondary threats of Iran, North Korea, and terrorism. But in any case, you get kind of the similar result, that the world is being kind of carved into spheres of influence or theaters of competition. Now that's where I come to the Gulf. What does this mean for the Gulf? Well, obviously, it means there's uncertainty. It means there's opportunities. It also means there's challenges. In terms of uncertainty, security and defense policies, especially in the GCC, since Desert Storm, the U.S. has been central to what the GCC countries have been trying to do. This U.S. preponderance, the fact that the U.S. is by far the largest military power in the region, is important. But whenever you have this kind of asymmetrical partnership or alliance, you always have what we refer to as the fear of abandonment. The smaller powers always worry, is can I rely on this big partner to defend me when I'm at my most vulnerable? And Gulf countries have always had this worry about the U.S. And I think that's a reasonable concern, because American interests have been what shaped its approach to the region. It's not out of an undying love or commitment to the Gulf per se. America's interests in freedom of navigation and global energy markets and Israeli security have shaped a lot of what it's meant to do in the Middle East and in the Gulf. And what we've seen in the past couple of decades is those interests have changed. Israel is not under the same type of threats it was. It doesn't need the same robust US military presence to secure it. Global energy markets are changing. The US is a producer, and most of the big customers are coming from East Asia. So why does the US have to secure that? freedom of navigation involves a lot of different countries now. It doesn't have to be US Navy, US bases maintaining it. So I think everybody looks at it and thinks, well, clearly US interests are shifting. It's only a matter of time before its policy catches up. And I think that's where we are right now. And I think that kind of explains this fear of abandonment that Gulf leaders have when they look at the US. This does lead to opportunities, of course, because having more suitors is always, it means more options. And we've seen that, especially in the Gulf. You see, especially the UAE and Saudi have been very active in developing relations with a lot of extra regional powers. Being based here in Abu Dhabi, I see this all the time. You know, the number of leaders from other countries who are coming and going, whether it's Japan or Prime Minister Modi, or whether it's Putin, or whether it's, you know, people come from Europe or the UK. There's a lot happening here. It's a very fluid moment in the Gulf where a lot of countries that have deep interests realize that they're going to have to play a larger role in securing those interests. It's always been easy, whether you're a US ally, partner, or competitor, to realize that US security commitments would maintain this Gulf order indefinitely. Excuse me. And you wouldn't really have to come up with any kind of corresponding security commitment. But that's changing. Countries are now starting to think, excuse me, that if the US isn't going to maintain security indefinitely, then they're going to have to play a larger role. So you see, for example, China helping Saudi Arabia with its ballistic missile program, which is, you know, something they've been working on for decades now. You see discussions about the F-35 sale to the UAE not going through, and then you see President Macron in town selling all of these Rafale fighter jets. You know, so it's not just a matter of, oh, what will we do? We can see what they're doing, that they have agency. They're looking towards other powerful countries and thinking, let's develop those relationships as well. Now, the last point I'll make, and I can see I'm coming up to that 15-minute point, is just about challenges. And again, nobody wants to be a theater of great power competition. This is not unique to the Gulf. Prime Minister Lee from Singapore wrote a really great article in Foreign Affairs in the summer of 20, where he basically said, look, it's not reasonable for leaders in Beijing and Washington to expect us to pick a side. We have tremendous interests with both countries. We have deep partnerships with both countries. We don't see the international order the same way you guys do. And you have to come around to understanding that we're not just going to accept this framework. I think that speaks to what a lot of countries in the region think. We saw that just in October here in Abu Dhabi, when Minister Anwar Gargash was at a public event, and he referred to the specter of great power competition and what it means for the UAE, saying, look, we do a lot of cooperation with the US, and we have for decades. Our most consequential external partner, a deep friend, but with concerns about the direction of what the US wants to do in the region. And China is the number 1 or 2, depending on the year, economic partner, China or India, increasingly doing a lot of interesting and important things in terms of vaccine development, in terms of AI, in terms of tech, in terms of infrastructure. So again, there's no appetite for choosing one or the other. So this, I think, is the big challenge, how to navigate this great power competition structure in a region where there's always been more than one choice, right? And what that means at the regional level, I think, is going to be very interesting. And that's where you can talk to some of my great colleagues from the UAE, who can talk about, you know, how they're looking at, you know, relations with Iran or Turkey or Saudi or Qatar, and what that means for events within the region. But I think just that kind of big picture I've just given you of what's happening at the global, how it could affect us, I think is also going to inform a lot of what happens in the next few years. So I'll stop here, but I look forward to any questions, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. Absolutely fascinating narrative that you laid out there. And if anyone calling into the breakfast briefing this morning has any questions, please, you know, just raise your hand or submit a question, and I'll endeavour to get those to Jonathan. I have a few questions. I think it's really interesting, something you touched on there, which is Russia, which is a subject of interest personally to me, and not just, you know, academically, but also professionally. I've spent most of my career covering energy in the Middle East and primarily OPEC. And, you know, I've been fascinated by Russia's engagement with OPEC, the creation of the OPEC Plus grouping, the pricing power that has increased around OPEC and that group of oil producers that essentially countered the effect of US shale, which balanced out this kind of global competition for world oil markets towards the end of the last decade. And then OPEC Plus happens, and you have this tilt back to these major producers, Saudi Arabia, Russia, the UAE, Kuwait, the Gulf producers. What I find interesting is that I think, you know, in relation to foreign policy and this great game that you lay out, is that my view is US military withdrawal, the security guarantee that goes with that. In a way, that this idea that the US is withdrawing somehow, I think that is possibly overstated. I think the US military presence, the US foreign policy presence, the US, the apparatus of providing that security blanket for the region is so entrenched, is so vast. There is so much material involved in that it's not going anywhere, and there's certainly no world power that's prepared to. That's misunderstanding Russian intentions and how Russian foreign policy works. What's really interesting here is that actually, and this is my own view around international institutions that govern the world's financial system. My view is things like the IMF, the World Bank, the G7, G20, you know, are paper tigers. You know, and I think that this is an outcome of 2008 and the global financial crisis and the ramifications that had for the world. I think that globally people look at these institutions and they think, well, what do you do? Actually, if you look, the most powerful, and this is my own view, the most influential and powerful economic institution in the world is OPEC and OPEC Plus. There's no other institution that I can think of that literally a decision can have a massive impact on global inflation, on the supply of primary energy. The ramifications, the ripples from this are vast. And this, coming back to Russia's influence and Russia's great game that it's playing to build global influence, but also to extend its influence in the Middle East, its participation in this OPEC pact. This has given Russia a seat at the table that was taken away by the international community. Now Russia is far more influential than it ever was within the G7, than it ever was within having any kind of voice in the IMF, the World Bank, because it's using its natural resource power, something that Russia has always done, and you can date that all the way back to the Tsars. And so, you know, Russia's participation in OPEC has not only strengthened OPEC in the wrapper of OPEC Plus, it's also strengthened the hand of its major Gulf partners. Having Russia as part of the OPEC Plus pact, it gives more international power economically to Saudi Arabia. It gives more international power and influence economically to Abu Dhabi, and we've seen that in you know, these tremendous moves in oil prices that we've seen over the last 2 years through COVID. You know, we go through a period of negative oil prices briefly in the US at the start of the pandemic, and we've had this huge rally that's come as we're approaching the end of it. And OPEC's been incredibly influential in marshalling that. And why I think it's important. Years ago, I remember I asked Jamie Dimon, who's the CEO of JP Morgan, which is the world's largest investment bank now, what was the one economic number he looked at every morning when he got up? And he said oil price. He didn't say interest rates. He didn't say money supply. He didn't say housing loans. He said oil. He said oil drives everything. Sure. It's the biggest input in economically in everyone's life. Even with energy transition, I don't see that changing in the immediate 10-year future, at least. So it's this fascinating point where economics and geopolitics meets, and what's in the middle at the moment? OPEC Plus. And it brings all these powers together that actually have and that's, I think, what the US is wrestling with at the moment. And you see this with, you know, Biden's release of the SPR to try and put pressure on OPEC. Its influence, America's influence to affect OPEC decisions has been diluted in a way by Russia's involvement in OPEC Plus, because OPEC Plus is so much more powerful than OPEC was. I mean, I just wondered what your thoughts about that. I know that I've rambled on a little bit there, but
no, I'm glad you did, because, you know, this is I'm spend most of my time just thinking about kind of the big picture political stuff. Like I said, I focus on China, Middle East relations in my research, and energy. I was saying to you before we went live, like everybody just kind of assumed that what China is doing here can be reduced to energy. And when I first started working on the topic back in 2010, I focused on energy a lot in my research, but of course I start to see more and more at play in terms of infrastructure, in terms of investment, in terms of development, in terms of security. And energy kind of became to me the less interesting part of the China Middle East story. I thought everybody knows about this, but there's all this other stuff happening. And as a result, I focused less and less on it in recent years. And, like you say, with OPEC Plus, that's really changed the narrative. I've got to bring this in a lot more. And it's like you say, with Russia, I was initially a little dismissive. I thought, look, they're competitors. And what Russia has to offer the world primarily is energy. And that's what the Gulf countries are doing as well. So, any moves towards any kind of greater cooperation is going to really be I thought undermined by the fact that they're really going to be competing with each other in something very important. But I think you're right. Russia's certainly found a way to insert itself into everything. I talked with a friend who was at a diplomatic event 2 or 3 years ago, focusing on the Gulf, and somebody went to him. He's a diplomat, and said, who should I be talking to to influence what's happening? And he pointed to the Russian head of delegations, that guy is the one who's making things happen today. And I was surprised, because we're so used to hearing it's somebody from the US or it's somebody from the UK, but Russia has made itself central to so much here. And it's I think it's not just about, OPEC Plus is a very fascinating part of it, but it's more than that, right? It's energy. It's the fact that even when they were on different sides, I think a lot of Gulf countries like the fact that they saw Putin standing by his guy in Syria and saying, hey, we like to see that in a great power partner, somebody who's going to.
But I guess coming back to the the China relationship with the region, that in that same time frame, you've had China's dependence on certainly the Gulf region for importing oil. 60% seaborne crude from the region heads to China. Very much powers their refineries, very much dependent on that crude. China's foreign policy relations coming out of 2003, post-invasion of Iraq, their understanding of that was very much around an OPEC framework that was essentially dominated by core Gulf states, OPEC controlling about a third of the world oil market. And then suddenly Russia comes into this, 15 years later, Russia comes into this scenario and is incredibly influential within this organization, and has the power to influence within this organization in a way that just never was the case when we go back to post 2003. And this brings in a new foreign policy dynamic that China needs to grapple with and understand, because China's foreign policy relations with Russia have not always been smooth, right?
Yeah, and that's again, to bring it back to China, that's an interesting point, because again, China seemed very content to just let others call the shots in the Gulf, but when they're paying $140 a barrel, and like you said, they're getting anywhere between 40 and 60% of their energy from the Gulf, that motivates them to play a larger role. And we've seen that, when it was always interesting to watch how Chinese leaders talk about this, because America would say, look, you're free riding, you're not doing anything to secure the region. And Chinese leaders would say, you just broke a rock and now we're spending $140 a barrel. What do you mean we're free riding? We're paying this ridiculous premium on your adventurism. So we have a different way of looking at it. And that leads to a whole lot of other questions about, how different powers look at stability and security. The US has approached it largely as a matter of approaching it from a military perspective. The Chinese leaders say it's not about coming in with an army, it's about coming in with development, and removing the need for an army. If you've got a stable economy and you've got jobs for people and you've got trade happening, then you don't need an army. So what they say is, let's go into the Middle East and build infrastructure, let's build roads and pipelines and stuff. So you're right. I think when we look at the energy dynamic, it really takes us into a whole lot of different directions, and it's just endlessly fascinating to me. And this really is the center of so much.
Yeah, I mean, we're coming to the end of our 30 minutes there. I could easily talk for another 30 minutes, if not another few hours on this subject, I think. I think your final point as well is very interesting around how China's foreign policy strategy has been built around the region and very much tied into the One Belt, One Road initiative that stretches all the way from China through into Africa. We've seen this investment, build, invest, build influence. But actually, I think this is one of the impacts of the pandemic, is that there has been somewhat of starting to be somewhat of a backlash to this, especially in some of the African countries where I think there is a growing realization and concern possibly about the influence that China has gained. Do you think that that there's hints of that now in the Middle East as well?
Not so much. I think if you look at a lot of the polling data, of course, during the pandemic, most Western democracies have had a horrible view of China, a reflection of China's handling of the pandemic in the early stages, a result of the way China's been talking about the rest of the world, its aggressive, wolf warrior diplomacy, and a lot of the, what it does domestically in Xinjiang and Tibet and Hong Kong, its threats towards Taiwan. A lot of countries in the West rightfully are calling China on that. But in a lot of the global South, they're saying, look, when we were at our most vulnerable, we needed vaccines, we needed PPE, we needed help. The US was cannibalizing itself politically. It didn't have anything to offer. Europe was kind of nowhere. The one great power that was showing up with testing kits and vaccines and all this stuff was China. So you see a kind of different way of looking at it. And the Arab Barometer had some really fascinating polling data or survey data last year, where they're saying, comparing China with other great powers, and the perspectives among Arabs in the countries they surveyed were overwhelmingly positive. I think that comes down to not just the response to the pandemic, but the fact that, like you said, IMF, World Bank, the way that the world has worked in favor of certain countries, and it hasn't worked in favor of others. And I think there's an appetite to see what leadership from or opportunities from other places might have to offer. So I think it's still early days. Nobody's really had the same depth of experience with China. So it allows you to look at it with kind of rose-covered glasses to think, it's never done anything bad to us. It's never colonized us. It's, never imposed these strict loan repayment plans, whatever. It could be that they'll get on the sharp end of it eventually. But right now, I think a lot of countries in Africa, a lot of countries in the Middle East look at China and say, hey, it's not like the other guys have done us any better. And they're here now.
No one's burning Chinese flags in the region, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's not the same. It's not the great Satan in Beijing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, we've come up to the end of our 30 minutes there, Jonathan. That's been an absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, that went fast.
Conversation. It went very fast. As I said, I think I could have continued that for another hour, and I'd quite happily continue for another 30 minutes into the next session. But this is the time we've got allocated. I don't know if anyone else on the call, if we've got any other callers, any other listeners who want to ask questions, or I guess not. It's very early here, so that may have something to play on this. But thanks very much.
Thank you. This would be the point in person where we go have a coffee and continue talking about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm gonna definitely contact you outside this, Jonathan, because I've got lots of questions to ask, and I'm heading up to Durham actually in March to. We conducted some research that I led at the end of last year to create a what we've packaged as an oil security sentinel for the region. And what we did was, over the last 5 years, we mapped all the reported attacks on physical oil infrastructure and shipping in the region, using some geospatial data that we collected, and analyzed the individual reports which we'd verified of these attacks, whether they were drone attacks, whether they were missile attacks, where they originated from. And it's really some interesting research. So I'd love to send that to you if I could get you an email.
That'd be great. And I'll put you in touch also with my colleague who I mentioned, Li Chen. She just had a book. I'm sure you know Robin Mills. I actually
yes, I know Robin. Yes.
Yeah, she and Robin just did a book recently on kind of future outlook on energy in the Gulf that might be interesting to you.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I think I remember seeing that. I need to check that out actually, and add it to the ever growing pile of books which I'm failing to get through at the moment. So
never shrinking.
Yeah. Great to talk, Jonathan, and hope to meet very soon the next time I'm in the Gulf.
Inshallah. Thanks, man. Good to meet you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.